Okay, thank you all so much. Tonight, we're going to talk about roles and responsibilities, and thought that this might be a good time to do that as we have new members to the board, and also want to say congratulations on the election, because it's one of those things where it's like, congratulations, now what? And so that's what we're hoping to do tonight, is just kind of go through some of those roles and responsibilities.
Let me interrupt you just a minute. Miss Krzyk has entered the room at 6:04. Thank you. Go ahead.
Sure. So before we really get into those roles and responsibilities, I want to kind of take a step back and look at just like a high-level view of municipal law basics, because everyone here has different backgrounds, and sometimes we bring those backgrounds, like whether it be in the corporate world, we apply what we know, but municipal law has some nuances, and so it's kind of important to understand what those nuances are. So also, if anybody has any questions along the way, feel free to ask. Happy to go into that. First of all, not all cities are created equal. So a lot of times people will say, well, Independence is doing this, or Lee Summit is doing this. Well, there could be a reason why. So there's many forms of different types of cities. There's the home rule charter. Home rule charter cities actually have a lot more power than what we call statutory cities, because they basically have all the power the Missouri legislature has, unless that power is somehow limited in the statute. So for example, more recently with the driving and texting laws, I had a city that wanted to start writing tickets to do that. However, under the statute, it says that the state preempts any local laws. And so basically what it was saying is cities, you can't write tickets for texting and driving. That's left up to the state. So that's an example where that particular city, because it was a home rule charter, it didn't have the power to write those tickets. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so, and I already knew we were fourth-class city, but I see that it's usually those with a population of 500 to 3,000. So why aren't we at third class, 3,000 to 30,000? And if a town grows, is there a formal process for them to go into another class, since if they're not going to choose to do home rule?
Yeah, no, good question. So what you see here is these population, that's at the time of formation. So you can continue to grow. If you grow, you stay that, and until you go through a process, you stay that class of a city. So if Raytown, I know that you have broached this subject before about maybe becoming a charter. If that's the case, then there is a process that you would follow to go through that. And because you are greater than 5,000 in population, you could do that. So yeah, but that's a good question.
Just to add before you go on, we've tried that process to become something more than a fourth-class city several times.
I know, I'm not talking about charter. I'm talking about being a third class.
Okay, I just didn't know
Yeah.
if you remembered that we had done that.
Yeah, oh yes, I do remember.
Okay. Not everybody knows that.
Yes, ma'am.
When was the last time we did that?
Do you remember?
It's like 2000 or 1990, I forget.
No, it's not been that long ago.
It was in the 2000s.
Yeah. 2013, I believe.
2013, something like that, yeah. We had what I thought was a pretty good charter. Of course, I was on the commission, so that makes sense that I would support it. But at the same time, when it came down to selling the charter to the voters, our commission just was not up to speed. People that should have been out talking to people were going into hiding, quite honestly.
Sure.
And I don't mean to be overly critical of them, but it just wasn't there to happen. It started out great guns and it was going strong, and there was some really lively conversations and debate when the Charter Commission went before us. We all settled down and came up with a conclusion, but once that happened, nobody would campaign for it. So it's easy to beat something when nobody's saying you should vote for it.
Right. Yeah. You have to sell that. You have to promote that. That's definitely.
We went out, a lot of the rest of us went out and campaigned for it, so I'll disagree with you on that one, but there's just a couple of small things that were in it that even though it was a great charter, We all worked hard on it. There's two things people didn't like about it, and that's why it failed.
Right, right.
Scarlett, did you have something to say? You're like,
Oh, no, I turned it off.
Okay.
go ahead, Councilman.
Sure, absolutely. So there's special charters, there's third-class cities. That's the first class we get to. That's what we call a statutory city, which I'll talk about in just a second. But as Alderwoman Krizek noted, Raytown is a fourth-class city, which is the most popular or most common type of city in Missouri. Again, population at the time of formation was somewhere in between 500 and 3,000. Fourth-class cities can be either the mayor-alderman form. So in those situations, a lot of times the mayor will act as like a city administrator, and they will help make those day-to-day decisions. Or in this case, the way Raytown is formed is we have a mayor, city administrator, board of aldermen form. And so we have that city administrator in there that kind of helps with those day-to-day operations. In fourth-class cities, the mayor only votes in the case of a tie, and as long as there's no conflict for him to vote. And then lastly, the specific statutes that we look to for fourth-class cities is Chapter 79. Other than that, just wanted to show you that there's lots of different political subdivisions out there, like towns and villages, there's special districts, so there's a whole bunch of different types of entities, political subdivisions that somewhat operate like cities, but they're not all created equal. So here's where we get to, when I talk about being a statutory city, here's what it boils down to. So this is what we call Dillon's Rule. And it was authored by Judge Dillon. He was a judge for the Iowa Supreme Court. And in one of his opinions, what he did was he broke down and he said, okay, so in order for a statutory city to have power, it all comes from either it has to be expressly granted in the statutes or the Constitution, so that power has to be there, or it has to be something that has to be implied. Or essential. So for example of that is that the Missouri legislature can in no way determine what every city could possibly need, right? They can't determine, okay, every city, you need a stop sign at Main and 2nd Street. Okay, so what they do instead is they say, okay, fourth-class cities, you have the power to regulate traffic in your city. So with that power, there's our power. Now we can actually, using that power, we can now make a rule that says we're going to have a stop sign at Main and 2nd Street. And if there's any doubt of whether a fourth-class city has power or not, what this rule says is that we don't have that power. We really have to go to the statutes or the Constitution in order to determine if we have the power. So a lot of times when you're asking me questions, it's not so easy sometimes to figure out. I have to go to those sources to say, okay, where's the power? How can we do this? Something else just to be aware of, that when you're sitting up there on the dais, there's going to be lots of different decisions that you will be making, and not all of them will be what I call a legislative decision. And it's kind of important to understand what type of decision you're making, because especially for me, because if you're making a legislative decision, which is, when we're making the rules for the city, right? We're putting in, code amendments, or we're determining we want animal control services, and what do those regulations look like? So those are legislative decisions, and a lot of times if those decisions are challenged, courts are not going to insert their belief into that decision. They're going to say, look, you are the legislature of Raytown. You're the experts of what your town needs. Even though I may not agree, your decision, I'm not going to go against your decision. So legislative decisions are a big part of what you do. And so, from a legal standpoint, those are the decisions I like to defend the cities of, because there's a lot more case law and support for those decisions. There's also going to be administrative laws that administrative decisions that you could make. And those come in the form of administrative decisions, or when you take those rules and you're applying them to a certain situation. Probably the one thing that probably relates the most is if, for example, someone is to come forward with a plat application. So a plat is a map that just, in essence, shows the land being divided and where the services, where our infrastructure will go, where the streets go. And so when people come forward with that, you're looking at it, you're in essence, staff has already looked at it and said, look, this now complies with our requirements. We have a whole subdivision section in our code that says this is what all plats should look like. And if this plat meets those requirements, then you have little or no discretion to not approve it. Okay? And then the last type of decision that you could possibly make is what we call a judicial decision when you're kind of interpreting those rules. There's very little decisions you make where you would be in that judicial role, but the one that that I see boards be in that role as if they're standing as a board of impeachment. So if we're impeaching, an alderman or mayor, then you would be the judicial, that would be your role, is determining those facts. Now, and I know I'm kind of moving pretty fast. A lot of these I could probably spend a whole lot more time on, but again, we're just doing really high view. Something that you may have questions about with regards to, staff brings forward an ordinance or a resolution, and, you may be asking yourself, well, why is this an ordinance versus a resolution, or, what's the difference? There is a difference. Ordinances are the legislative acts. They tend to create new law. But they can also be like, I have certain cities that adopt everything by ordinance. That's just a policy decision they make. Every contract that comes forward, everything they decide, everything is ordinance. And that's the way they want to do it, and that's on them, right? Resolutions, though, are more administrative acts. Courts have described resolutions as a mere expression of the board. There's no real distinction between a resolution and a motion, other than the resolution is written. And to talk a little bit more about the resolutions typically deal with matters of special or temporary character. The exception to this is that there is a statutory provision that talks about if we are going to amend the budget above, increase a budget, that we have to bring forward a resolution that first explains why are we having to increase the budget. Resolutions do not require any formalities of procedure. So unlike ordinances, which we'll talk about in a little bit, there's a procedure to them. Also, resolutions don't have to be signed. So in essence, they're kind of veto proof because the mayor doesn't have to sign them. It's our policy that he does. Lastly, there's no real statutory requirement that you even record ayes and nays. However, there's a sunshine law requirement that says we have to, if we're going to vote on something, we have to record the ayes and nays. So that's why, with regards to resolutions, we can all just say all in favor, aye, all opposed, nay. Although the city has certain requirements that it typically will do roll call votes. And again, that's a policy decision. So kind of switching back to ordinances, they have to be adopted by a legally existing governing body. Sounds kind of weird, but in my line of work, I have seen, homeowners associations saying, I want to change the speed limit in our neighborhood from 25 to 15. Well, it's not valid because they aren't an existing governing body. So the governing body also has to have the power to act, and that ordinance has to be within their scope of their power. So, fourth-class cities can't declare our war on China, so let's not try and pass an ordinance that says you can, okay? Ordinance has to be reasonable, has to be definite, has to have certain terms, has to be for a certain term. So, and reasonable, that's one of those fluff words that's like, okay, that's a catch-all, if you will, but it does have to be definite and certain so the people that come along and are reading those ordinances can kind of understand what it is that the governing body is trying to do, right? It has to be adopted in a required form, and it has to follow a proper procedure. So there is a form. So if you ever look at ordinances, they have a title. They have some whereas clauses, which aren't required, but that's a great opportunity, and I encourage us to always have whereas clauses, because that's kind of the roadmap of why the governing body is looking at and, adopting the ordinance. It also is a place that we like to put, what is your authority to adopt this ordinance? So those are things that I like to see in the ordinances. It also has to contain the language, be it ordained by, has to have that language in there, which you'll notice those ordinances do. And then it has to have, when is it effective? It doesn't necessarily have to be upon approval. It could be at a date in the future. It could, it could be, whatever the case may be, depending on what you're voting on. And then it has to be signed by the mayor unless the mayor vetoes it. And then it goes into a process of where the board would then have the opportunity to override that veto. So there's a lot more to ordinances. Also, procedurally, ordinances have to be read 2 times before passage, and they can be read by title as long as that bill is available prior to the city, prior to the governing body considering that ordinance. So a good rule of thumb is that the ordinance, if it's available, when you get your packet, that's a good rule of thumb to say that's when the ordinance is available and you can read it just by title only. I know this board, we've had a couple times had to read ordinances in full at meetings, and that's not a fun time. That's not a fun time to hear me read an ordinance twice, or Teresa. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Appreciate the reminder. Ordinances, they're supposed to, there's a reason, I think this is important to be stated. The reason why we read them twice is so that the public has time to become aware of them, and they can then get back to their representatives to say what they feel about them if they so desire. And when we push stuff through so fast that the public does not hear anything about it until after it's done, that doesn't happen. And I think that's a mistake. It's something I think we should try to avoid whenever we can. Have you gone up to the Roberts Rules in Order yet?
I'm getting there. I'm so sorry.
Okay.
I know you want to speak about that, so
Mr.
I
Walden,
will get that.
I'm going to ask everybody something for housekeeping here. She's got 53 pages. If you would,
But I
make
will-
notes of your questions, and at the end, we'll let her answer the questions. This way she can get through, and then we can ask the questions, because somewhere part of what you may ask, she may answer already before we get there. So if you don't
That's,
mind.
okay, so
Counselor,
we'll
go
change
ahead
that, but I did say
and
that in the
last
beginning
question
that he
again.
could
Thank you.
answer.
I was just
Yeah,
trying to
you
find my
did.
place on the pages.
Yeah, no worries,
Okay.
no worries there. But what you bring up is that the board has adopted a rule where we read those ordinances, we do a first reading, and then we come back at the subsequent meeting and read a second time. That's what you're talking about. That's a little different. The statute only requires 2 readings. It can be at the same meeting. But you're right, Raytown has a different rule. So that's the procedurally, ordinances are a lot different than resolutions. Also, ordinances have to be in harmony with the Constitution and the laws. So, of course, we have to look kind of up the chain, and that is we have to look at statutes, make sure that our ordinances are in line with the statute, and then in line with the Constitution, and then in line with the U.S. Constitution. So we have to do all those things. And then lastly, ordinances should serve a public purpose. Okay, parliamentary procedure, here we are. This is the only page I have on parliamentary procedure, because we could really do a whole hour on just rules of decorum. But the reason we have parliamentary procedure is that it helps run and make an effective meeting. I can't tell you how many meetings I've been at where we have people on the dais talking, and then we have someone yelling in the audience, and a meeting that should maybe take, maybe half hour to an hour ends up taking 2 to 3 hours, because we just can't seem to, we need someone to run those meetings. So Robert's Rules is probably the most popular. Most of my cities have adopted Robert's Rules. But that's not the only rules of procedure. And in fact, there's a lot of other rules of procedure out there that are designed specifically for smaller boards. And so if the city were to ever, I mean, the city doesn't have to adopt Robert's rules. You could change that if you wanted, but there is alternatives. Okay. Now moving on to ethics and conflicts of interest. Okay, something else to be very aware of. So this is section 105.452 of the statutes. And it's really, it's designed, it's aimed at elected or appointed officials, but also employees. And what it says is, and a lot of this is, should be, should sound familiar, should not be a surprise, but you can't act or refrain from acting or because of an offer to pay. So in essence, you can't take a bribe. And that doesn't have to be necessarily monetary. It could be anything of value, Chiefs tickets, what have you. If it's some kind of, I'm going to give you Chiefs tickets if you'll vote a certain way, that's definitely a bribe. You can't use or disclose confidential information obtained in office for financial gain. So you're gonna, you hear a lot of confidential information, and so those are things that need to stay confidential. You can't favorably act on a matter that's designed to provide a special monetary benefit. And so I have that in quotes because the statute does define special monetary benefit, and that is you can't vote on something that's going to provide you a special benefit that no one else in the city has benefited. So the way I always just describe this is that let's say you were voting to improve a street in front of your house. And in my mind, you can vote on that because every house on that street is receiving the same benefit. There's nothing special that you're receiving. However, if we're going to pave a road and you're the only house on that road, that's a little bit different situation. So you can't use your decision-making authority for financial gain, and you can't advocate for an appointment in exchange for something of value. There's also, and these are I would say the main conflict of interest statutes, but there are several others. So when we are looking at conflict of interest, when you have a question, is everything okay? Okay. So when we're looking at conflict of interest questions, we have to go through each statute and say, okay, do we pass this statute? Okay, now we have to go to this one. Now we have to go to this one. So there's several. But something else that the statutes provide for is that and this is specific to members of the governing body, is that for individuals, you can't perform a service for the political subdivision for pay, other than the pay you already get. You can't sell, rent, or lease property to the city. However, there are exceptions. And the exceptions are if the transaction's below $500 or $5,000 per year, or if it's going to be above that, if it was competitively bid and you were the lowest bidder. So some examples of that, I have some cities where, again, everybody has a different background. One of my cities, the mayor owns a lawn and landscape business. And so he's like, I'm happy to, mow all the city property. And so those were things that we started to look at and say, okay, there are some stipulations there for not only him, but then also his business, because it then goes down to if you own or are part owner of a business, if you own 10% or more of your business, then there are the same types of criteria where you can't perform a service for the city for pay, you can't engage in a property transaction, and again, those exceptions apply. So just something to be aware of. So what happens if you do have an interest in an ordinance that's coming before you? What you want to do is, this is regarding a substantial personal private interest. What these conflict of interest statutes really looking for is what type of, is there some kind of monetary benefit that you're receiving, right? By voting on this, I'm receiving some kind of monetary benefit. And what you have to do is you have to file a written report with the city clerk of what the nature of this conflict is. And that has to be done before the ordinance is adopted. And however, the statutes do say that if you, and this city is required to file personal financial disclosures each year, if you've already disclosed that under your financial disclosure report, you don't have to then report it again to the city clerk. Yes, sir.
Should that be made public?
Mr. Walters,
Yes.
as I said, let's wait till she's done and make notes, and you can ask at the end.
I have a lot
Thank
of
you.
questions.
And if you would, turn off your mic so that it's not.
Oh,
picking it up.
sorry.
Something else I'll just say is that when we look at conflicts of interest, you will fail in the court of public perception long before you'll have an actual legal conflict of interest. So a lot of times people will ask me, is there a conflict? And my opinion may be there's not really a legal conflict, but they still feel the need to, recuse themselves or whatever they may do. And so that's a personal decision for you to, for you. But I will just say a lot of times there really isn't legal conflict of interest. So with that said, nepotism, this is an important one. So this is really dealing with when can you work with members of your family. And so this is a Missouri constitutional provision. It applies to all public officers, employees, and what it basically says is you cannot name or appoint a relative within the fourth degree of consanguinity or affinity. Consanguinity means by blood, and affinity is by marriage. And so as you can see on the screen, that goes out, the 4 degrees go out. So we're talking up to great nieces, great aunts, first cousins. Those are the areas where, it kind of goes far out with regards to who you can appoint and not appoint. And the reason this is so important is that if you happen to do that, the constitutional provision is self-enforcing, which means you are automatically ousted from office. So giving you an example, 2008, City of Holden has an election. Their chief of police, who everyone loves, was voted mayor. So he gets in, the first thing he does is he's like, my seat is vacant for the fire chief, I'm going to appoint my brother-in-law. And that's exactly what he did. And then somehow he gets notified that, hey, you can't do that. And so his brother-in-law was like, hey, I'll just step down. Well, the attorney general got involved and said, hey, you can't fix this problem. You are the one that's out. And so he's like, I understand. So he steps down from the mayor role. So in a fourth-class city, when there's a vacancy with the mayor, the aldermen get to appoint a mayor. And so they liked him, and they're like, we're going to appoint this guy back into office. And so the attorney general said, okay, you guys aren't getting this as creative, but you don't get this. He is ousted until the next term. And so I think that's exactly what happened. I think he came back on the next term, but just so you can kind of understand, this is a big deal. So that does not mean, though, however, that if you have a relative that's already with the city or that comes to the city and wants to work with the city, that does not mean that you can't work with them. It just means that you can't appoint them. So, and I also refrain from anything like, giving them a raise, anything specifically involving them. And here's what I mean when we say, we'll fail in the court of public perception long before we will have a actual, meet the definition of a legal conflict of interest is that there's this appearance of impropriety. And so definitely it's generally not a legal conflict. It could have a potential to be, but what you really need to do is if you think there is a conflict, come talk to me, and we can talk through whether we think, whether it really truly is or not. Disclose it on the record. Keep in mind, your constituents, they elected you to vote. And so if there's a matter that they have a conflict in or think they have a conflict and you're not voting on it, there would be some questions to be asked. So, that's why I think it's important to put it on the record to say, hey, I have a conflict or I think it's a conflict. And it just kind of does that balancing act of my role here is to vote, but also I want to disclose this conflict. If you do have a conflict, leave the dais and don't participate in the discussion. Now, Raytown has some specific rules on conflicts of interest, Section 2-260, which basically says that if you have a substantial personal or private interest in a bill, you have to disclose it, and then you have to refrain from voting. There's also Section 2-262, which talks about those yearly financial disclosures that have to be done, with regards to if you have to report if you've done any business with the city, and that has to also be filed by the finance director and the city administrator. Okay. All right, now we're getting to with all that kind of in the background, now we can kind of go on, start talking a little bit about what are the roles. So under the statute, section 79-110, so what it states is basically the mayor and the board of aldermen have the care, management, and control of the city and its finances. Big, broad scope, right? You have the power to enact all ordinances that aren't repugnant to the Constitution or the state statute, and those ordinances shall be deemed expedient for the good government of the city, preservation of peace and good. So it has a lot of this fluff, a lot going on here. There's also a long list in the section 79-370 to 79-480 that talks about some additional powers like, regulating draymen, and I mean these are old statutes that have not been updated in a long time. So that's the statutory role, but let's talk really practically. What is the role of the board? Represent the public, right? Develop and evaluate policies and programs. Maintain fiscal integrity. Determine services. I mean, can you imagine a city where, only the people that can afford to have the firemen come and put out a fire in their house are the ones that get that service? Or, only the people that can afford to repair a pothole in front of their house are the only ones that get that service. So this is why, these are the services that we've determined. Animal control is a good example for the city of Raytown, because for a while there, it was maybe, trying to determine what do we do with animal services, just because it's such a hard topic, and a lot of cities are struggling with that. And lastly, ensure accountability and transparency. So, not to hurt anybody's feelings, but as an alderman, individually, you don't have a lot of power. Actually, you really have none. It's only as a collective body and really a majority of the board that you actually have power. So kind of like, if you can tell on the screen, you see a little fish, that yellow fish, don't be the yellow fish. Talking about the role of the mayor. Okay, this is by statute, this is what the statute says. He sits on the board of aldermen, only votes and break a tie. You preside at the Board of Aldermen meetings. You have jointly with the board the care, management, and control of the city. You exercise general supervision over all the officers. You're active and vigilant in enforcing all laws. You make recommendations to the board. You can pardon people. And you can veto bills. Okay. But now just talking practically. Board members should actually feel like they can meet with the mayor on a routine basis to discuss those ideas and concerns. Then the mayor works closely with the city administrator to move those goals forward, manage the actions of the board. And all this works most effectively if the mayor understands the concerns of the board and they share and this feedback with the city administrator. I mean, that's like in a perfect world, right? It's really all about communication. I provided this slide only to show you that there's lots of roles for members, and if you read some of these, they're like any roles that we've been discussing. However, this is the city of Kingston, Canada. So I mean, it's not just a local. This is not just a Missouri thing or not just a United States thing. There's roles of their members are all similar. So moving to the statutory role of a city administrator, those regulations are found in Chapter 77, which is not the fourth-class city, but the third-class city. Not sure why the legislature put that there, but that's where the authority for fourth-class cities to have a city administrator, it's in that chapter. But basically, city administrator, the city may by ordinance provide for that. And then the city administrator has the general, control of administration of the management of the government, business officers, and employees of the city, subject to the direction of the mayor. So, practically speaking, what are some roles of staff? What should they be doing for you guys? Offering professional advice. Keep in mind that this is what they do every day. They're in their role. This is why they went to school. They've got certifications. This is their role. They're the professionals. So that's their role, is to offer that. Also, when you make a decision, when you're with regards to a policy decision, that's their job, is to implement that. And if once you give that direction, then the way they do that is by establishing some administrative practices. So if you say we want animal control, then staff is going to come back and say, here's how we're going to do animal control. Also, to maintain operations of the municipality. So all the services that you say that we should provide, they're operating and trying to maintain all that. So there's a couple of slides right here, which I'm going to explain this whole concept since we're running a little low on time, and I apologize. But these 3 slides all kind of say the same thing. And what I will say is this is the analogy I like the best, which is why I'll use this slide. But if you can see down kind of 3/4 of the way, there's a bar that's kind of green. And the, from left to right, on the left-hand side, it's more green than on the right-hand side. And so the green represents the council or the board's responsibilities, okay? And the idea being is that, thinking of a flight analogy, at 50,000 feet, you are looking at the purpose, the vision of the city. Where do you want to see the city? I mean, right now we're working on a comprehensive plan. Where do we want to see the city? How do we want to, what direction we want to move to? You then, as the plane is landing, now at 40,000 foot, you're establishing those strategic goals. How do we get to that vision? Here's a vision. What's feasible? Well, this might be a little more feasible. So what's that strategic goal? And, staff is providing more of a supporting role, trying to provide you information. And they're trying to look at, okay, what resources do we have that can help align these goals? And then as the plane is coming down, there's priority action items at 30,000 foot. So you're establishing, priorities. And, again, staff is just looking to see where do we have, where are those funds going to come from? What equipment do we need? How, what personnel do we need? So they're kind of looking at that. You're the big high level. Planning and oversight, you have a little bit in there because you're adopting the budget. But, staff is doing now more of the day-to-day. And then as projects, as the plane is landing, you're having a less and less involvement because the city is just kind of carrying out the day-to-day responsibilities. Bless you. So, establishing expectations. I won't read this. Landwehr's rules. This was and the mayor's laughing because you might have known the mayor of Jefferson City. He was Mayor Landwehr. He was the mayor from 2003 to 2011, and so he just had he had a different way of, what his roles and responsibilities, what he thought there was, and so this is really from him. I have a couple of colleagues that worked with him, which is how we got his list. But the one thing that on this one that I do like is that 1, 2, 3, the 4th one down, even if you deserve it, do not publicly criticize the integrity or intentions of a fellow office holder or staff person. Disagree with ideas, not people. And I really like that. Preference statements of disagreement with an acknowledgement of the other person's perspective. So I like that a lot, but these are kind of funny to read through. So some more. He also had a phrase where he's like, don't stump the chump. If you know you're going to bring something up, it's, talk to staff and let them know that, hey, this is what we're going to talk about, and I have a question about this, so that we can bring forward, answers to those questions and make it a more meaningful discussion. So, expectations of elected officials. Understand the responsibilities of the public office, comply with the law, practice good behavior, perform duties, participate in public meetings, effective communication, avoid conflicts of interest, speaking on behalf of the city or appearing to. We need to be careful about that, and that's something that we'll kind of bring back is we're looking at a social media policy, and this is where we get a little bit more into those things, excuse me, because it's so easy now to get on social media, and there may not be a clear line of who's speaking. Is it the city or is it the person? Respect and adhere to the city administrator form of government, positive work environment. Again, I don't think any of these are really shocking, but I think they're important. So what are staff members' expectations of the board? One is to prepare for meetings. There's a lot of time that goes into preparing those staff reports, the ordinances, all of that. I ask you just read it because that might answer a lot of questions. Whenever possible, call the city administrator with your questions before the meeting so that, staff has an opportunity to research and can bring forward, some answers to those questions. Examine all the facts on a given issue, make the best decision possible. And by the way, we'll talk a little bit about what staff's roles should be too here in the next slide. Do not ridicule or make light of staff in public. We want to, instead provide criticism in private and through the city administrator. Don't assume staff is wrong and the citizen is right when there's a disagreement. So a lot of times, you will hear from your constituents that staff maybe didn't do something, and that's not always the case. There's always lots of different sides to any story. So, that's just something to keep in mind. Compliment the staff when and where appropriate. That's free to do. Trust and respect staff. If the board disagrees with the staff recommendation, maybe explain the reason why. Don't hold a grudge, and act in a fair, ethical, and consistent manner. Oh, sure. So what should the board members' expectations be of staff? Be well organized. Anticipate the type and kind of information that you'll need to make the decisions you have to make. I think staff tries to do that, but there's always those one-offs where we can't always anticipate. Respond to requests for information in a timely and professional manner. You expect that. Prepare accurate, well-documented, and well-written reports. I always like to give options. Here are 3 options that you could go with. Instead of just saying, you need to do this, that's my personal view, as I like to give you options. Provide exhibits, illustrations, pictures, just to help visualize, which I think staff does a pretty good job of that too. Leave personal or political bias out. Help orientate new members. Be accessible to aldermen, whether in person at meetings or on the phone. Keep all aldermen equally informed. So more than likely, if you have a question or an issue, there might be others on the board that also have that. So I know the city clerk is pretty good about, she will send out an email to all the board just to say, here's the information that so-and-so asked. Implement board decisions after they're made. You expect that, and act in a fair, ethical, and consistent manner. Okay, so how do things go wrong? And they typically do. So, sorry about this, I should have fixed all this. So what causes a difficult board member, right? And it may not be that they're difficult, it just may be that the member represents maybe a different viewpoint, a new viewpoint. I recently was at a city that was discussing chickens, and for the longest time they had voted no chickens, no chickens, no chickens, but there was a change of heart and now there's chickens. Inappropriate expectations of what the role of the board member is. Again, board needs to work together, right? It doesn't mean you have to agree on absolutely everything, but you do have to decide, and, still have to work with everybody. Sometimes board members come with campaign promises. Maybe it's hey, I'm going to drain the swamp, City Hall needs to be drained. But, a lot of times what happens is they may get into the position and realize, oh, this is not exactly what I thought it was. I get it now. And then the problem is if you run on those campaign dreams, then all of a sudden now you're going to have to work with the people that you were saying need to leave. So that could just cause some issues. Obviously, we want to keep local issues local. We don't need to deal with national issues here. We just want to deal with our local issues. A lot of people have an urge to fix things, and that's not necessarily wrong, but you need to understand the role is that you are not the one down in the pit with the meter guy. You are making decisions on this dais, and you let them do that work. There's, sometimes a failure to misunderstand the board administrator relationship, and there's also sometimes a fear that, this is a hard decision, and if I vote yes or if I vote no, how will that look to my constituents? So there's those types of things. I don't mean that it's definitely, necessarily a difficult board member, but those are some reasons why. Okay, characteristics of difficult board members: they interfere with employees. I had a city where we had an alderman who decided to look over as the workers were digging a trench because she thought she could just figure out what was going on and then tell them what to do. That creates a lot of issues, not to mention safety, demanding special access. Got to, keep in mind that one of our first rules is we got to be good stewards of city funds. And if we're always, interrupting staff and they're not able to do their job, then that creates a situation of, treat every staff presentation as an inquisition, routinely disclose confidential information, really not just to the media, but to anybody. Spends all of his or her time on minutia, misses kind of the big picture of things. Is never prepared for a meeting, kind of regularly asks questions that, are already answered in the board packet. Is never willing to bring closure, always wants more information before voting, which is kind of different than, if you need information to vote, that's different than just trying to keep pushing something off because you don't want to ever make a decision. And lastly, refuse to abide by the meeting rules of order. Sorry, not lastly. Circumvent the city administrator, goes directly to staff. Just trying to make staff, city administrator, fellow elected officials look bad. So tips: how do we deal with these types of difficult people? Exercise emotional maturity and intelligence. Try to be professional. Don't make it personal. Keep communication open. It really doesn't help to shut down communication. We got to keep going through until we get to a solution. Keep everything in perspective. Insulate staff from negative comments to the greatest extent possible. Help the board and staff stay focused on the work. Accept that the best you may be able to do is minimize the negative consequences of their conduct. I mean, you may not be able to fix the problem, but if we can mitigate some of that. Also use procedural rules to control the meeting. Mayor is the presiding officer. You keep order, which you've been doing. Don't allow board members to speak unless recognized, which you do a good job of. Don't allow public to interrupt. Anytime you want a discussion, there has to be a motion to put that topic on the floor. Roll call votes force a commitment. So a lot of times it's going to force you to either vote for something, against it, or abstain. Stick to the agenda. And then lastly, board comments should just be that, comments. A lot of my cities will, in their comments, they'll want to ask for something to vote on something. And so if you want the board to vote on something, it needs to be an item on the agenda. Okay, so what happens when we have really, really bad behavior? Is she okay? Okay. So we've had some situations where sexual harassment, that's a situation. What do? You're going to call the city attorney. We're going to follow personal policies. Criminal activity, we're going to call 911. Ethics, you're going to call the city attorney, but you're also going to contact the ethics commission. And then nepotism, again, as I said, you're immediately ousted from office. So there's no fixing that. Okay, nuclear options. So what happens if none of that is working, right? So we could try some personal intervention, soliciting help from others, maybe an outside facilitator, censure. So formal and outside intervention kind of includes if there's a formal complaint, we do an investigation. It could result in some kind of censure. Censures only require a majority of the board and can't be public or private, or can be public or private, sorry. Probably the highest level of intervention is the impeachment. And that is where the board adopts an articles of impeachment. There's a hearing, and the board, that's where you stand as a jury to determine does those actions rise to the level of impeachment. Okay, so good boards have good meetings, and I think we're almost done here. They're smooth and productive meetings. Staff lets the board know when controversial issues are coming up. You're given enough information to make an informed decision. However, it's not so much information that you're invited to micromanage. Staff should be, making sure that like math and calculations are all set for you, so you're not sitting there trying to add up things. And follow the agenda, follow good procedure. And here's where I say we shouldn't be invited to micromanage. If the public comes to you and says, okay, we need a new community center, and the board says, great, I'm going to direct staff. Okay, how do we get a community center? Staff shouldn't be coming back to you saying, okay, well, what color the building should be, and what should the plants outside be, and what kind of hand dryer should we use, and those types of things, right? They should be bringing information to you saying, here it is. Lastly, always be polite, show respect, always address the chair. This is where the more formality comes in with mayor or alderman. Turn your mic on when you speak, turn it off when you're done. Pay attention to the speaker, don't look at your phone. Okay. All right. So, do we want to do questions, or do you want me to maybe take questions if you want to get me afterwards?
Aretha Hayden, we still got a little time.
Okay.
I guess the first thing is the expectations of the elected officials. Do we have, and I know that you have here practice good behavior. I noticed specifically, speaking on behalf of the city, and I noticed that, I know that when I went to one of the MML conferences, it talked about that you can be held personally responsible for incorrect information, speaking on behalf of the city, through a blog, email, Facebook, even if it's your personal blog, email, Facebook, electronic. Tell me about that. Is that true? Or if I send it from my personal email and I say something that the board decided on and it's incorrect information, I just want to clarify that. I can be held personally responsible for that incorrect information if it causes harm or misinformation.
So where that gets to is if it's not in, so if you're acting outside the duties of what your job is here, then yes, you could be held responsible and liable under that. So I'm going to give you the classic legal answer as it depends. Because if the board has directed you, Aretha, I want you to send out this email, or I want you to send out on this post, I want everybody to post what a great project, this new community center, this is an example, but new community center, and let's say you by accident send something out and you're like, ooh, I misunderstood. I don't think that rises to the level for you to be personally held responsible. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Then my next question is, so the staff members' expectation of board members, I see that you say prepare for meetings by reading all reports, ordinances on the agenda. I think that's important to restate that because I see so many times that we ask questions once we get up here that's already in the board packet. So I like the fact that, that you say prepare for it, come with your questions or ask. What I do sometimes if I know the person that's doing the presentation, I'll ask them a question before the board meeting because sometimes it can be as easy as a yes or no.
Right.
So I just wanted to bring that up again so that everybody sees that in order for you to be an effective board member, you should prepare and read the information before the board meeting. Sometimes I pick up my packet on the day of, but I've already gone and looked at it electronically. It's on there electronically, usually on that Friday before our board meeting. So you can go and review it then. I like the paper because I can make my notes, but even if you don't, if you're not able to get up here, it would just be helpful and less irritating if you get up, if you come prepared. And then I saw one other thing. Candy, when you talked about the bad board member, so if we have a board member, an alderman, that's an elected official, but he or she has all the characteristics or the majority of the characteristics of a difficult board member. And they continue to do all of these characteristics. I see on here that you say that they can be impeached. So can an elected official, because we've already done the outside intervention, can an elected official be impeached? And what does that entail?
So yes, but what that entails is impeachment is the whole process. So we rely on cases to say what is that level of impeachment. And so what would happen is that there would be articles of impeachment drawn up saying this is where we think, this person has not done what they were supposed to do, or they did it in such a way that we think it violates their duties. And so that would be when you guys would be up on that dais and you would be having to determine, does it rise to that level? And so, so.
And then do that person, if they are impeached, do we fill their position by an appointment, or what happens to that alderman position?
Right. So if they're impeached, then the seat is vacant. If it's determined by the board that, yes, we feel like you have violated, then the seat becomes vacant, and then you fill the vacancy by the mayor appoints, and then the aldermen confirm.
Okay, this is going to be my last, it's not a question, it's just a statement. Sure. But I like the expectation of the elected officials where it says practice good behavior and effective communication. Sometimes when we have discussion or heated discussion and it rises to the level of disrespect to either an alderman or the mayor, I think that is not only embarrassing to the city, but it's embarrassing to the board. So I think that if you get to the point where you really don't agree or you're upset or you think that something has been said, I think we probably need to table it or talk to the mayor or the board of aldermen or the alderman that said that or after the meeting. Because know that our constituents are watching. And I don't think it's fair that anybody should know that I don't like Alderman Mims. We should always be on one accord when we're up here.
Right.
Nobody should be able to tell that we don't like one another. Right. When we come here, and if you're the minority in the equation, you're going to have to decide to back away. You still vote your conscience, but at the same time, you have to practice good behavior and effective communication. That's all I'm going to say.
Gotcha.
Thank you. So we're up against the clock.
Yeah.
Mr. Walters, I don't see anybody else's light lit for now. So here's what we're going to do. Make it short. Do what you need to do. Make sure your microphone's on, by the way. And when you're done, if we have other questions, then we'll gather them and we'll have the city attorney answer them for all of us at another time. Is that all right with you, Counselor?
Absolutely.
Okay, Mr. Walters, you got 2 minutes.
I think what I will do is just reserve my comments for later if I only have 2 minutes to speak them. I would like to have the opportunity to talk to the city attorney privately on some of the items she has brought up recently in here without enumerating them, because I think she's mistaken on a number of them from sources that I have that are of legal nature. So, and I don't know what's funny about that, but I mean, that's
Anything we discuss with her, unless
certainly.
it's something that is of personal nature, it'll be for the whole board, just like when anybody
I know,
asks
but-
questions of the city clerk. So,
There's no way I can push it into 2
and
minutes.
one other thing I will say before we adjourn this part of the meeting is, for those of you that are new, if you don't have a copy yet, because I know when everybody's new, things are rolling, we do have a ethics for the Board of Aldermen that was passed by this board. We've even had somebody that has been brought before on those charges. So those are part of this, and those are what make this stick if we have a problem. So make sure you have a copy of those. Make sure you look those over very well. So with that being said,
Everybody has a copy.
you have something?
Everybody has a copy. It came in there.
Everybody has a copy. Very good. I just want to make sure. Sometimes they get mixed. Okay. I hear a motion for adjournment. Ms. Rita Hayden has a motion to adjourn. Who got second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Morales. All right. Call the roll, please. Ms. Henry?
I'm getting there. I
Oh,
didn't,
okay.
I didn't
No,
have
you're
any
not
call roll on that.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Adjournment. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Anyone against? All right, we're adjourned at 7:06.